Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to meet you because this is how we meet each other nowadays. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. In this virtual world that we live in, I think I bring a lot of reality to particularly tech and innovation in the places that we want to go. Technology and innovation and working with entrepreneurs and futurists has been a passion as well as an avocation. I'm really lucky that I get paid to do something really fun, which is a lot of times kind of like going to a science fair or peeking behind, the next big gadget, elevator. And so my passion is working with people that are Imagineers and futurists, whether it be, autonomous cars, artificial intelligence, robotics. These are things I've been working on for the last not just 5 or 10 years. And when the consumer sees it fairly late in the market, I'm oftentimes in front of these things 15, 20 years in advance, which
Phenomenal.
is
That's
which
that's
is very
great.
exciting.
That sounds like a dream job. How did you get this job? I would
Yeah.
love this job.
Well, I was a reporter when I first got out of college, so I like to say that I actually my number two pencil was pretty sharpened by the time I was 13. My family owned a publishing business and a whole array of newspapers, and so I used to trail behind one of my uncles, and I would go out and I would do a little bit of news reporting. And so by the time I got into high school, I was the editor-in-chief of school paper, but I was also working
Nice.
for community papers. And then that took me, to study journalism and then eventually get, be a full-time reporter I was with Reuters, I was with Washington Post and BBC. And that took me on a lot of tours. I used to call it my tour of duties, which is very similar to military. I would get
Hmm.
dispatched or deployed. I didn't have a news desk job, so I was constantly on the road. And I took all that knowledge and information and I came back to Silicon Valley, which is where I grew up, only trying to leave it. And then I realized what a blessing it was for me to actually be raised and nurtured and around the intersection of technology and agriculture simultaneously. And now it's even more important because I work with a lot of ag tech companies. And so
Mm.
it's come to full circle.
Fantastic. I love it. Well, this is the heart of innovation, right? This is where all the cutting edge stuff happens. I mean, even though you keep hearing people saying, "Oh, this innovation is happening over here," we're still kind of far ahead of almost everywhere else, I
Yeah,
find.
absolutely. Now, I was speaking to a farmer in the Midwest a few weeks ago, and he says, we're so far apart from the Silicon Valley to the Midwest. And I said, in terms of advancements in technology, farmers are trying to find new ways to create new economic, uh, return on investment, operation efficiency, to be able to better their supply chain. They make money at the end of the day. And so we had a really interesting conversation how I grew up in 4-H and I grew up in agriculture, but at the same time, within arm's length of technology. And what's happening is these pockets of, Livermore, California, the Central Valley, going up to Napa, California farmers are really leading the way in how technology is being applied to old school jobs like agriculture. And
Hmm.
agriculture is actually all about sustainability. It's about responsibility. It's looking at climate change. The Farmer's Almanac. I wish somebody would come up with the Farmer's Almanac like 3.0. We all talk
Hmm.
about the metaverse. We need like the new farmers version of the metaverse.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I'm assuming technology have they been able to sort of embrace new technology, most farmers? Because I'm assuming that really increases productivity and does a lot of great things.
It depends on the words that are being used. So
Hmm.
in the West Coast in California, and I'd say the agricultural arena, words like sustainability make a lot of sense. So you take that to a fifth generation wheat farmer or corn in Iowa or any of the the traditional agricultural states that's not growing produce and vineyards. Sustainability is almost like a foreign word to them. But they
Mm.
do understand climate change. They do understand that they need to diversify and they need to make money. So that we can't always take our marketing nomenclature and apply it to a market that doesn't, isn't necessarily familiar with those terms. And I call that ego engineering versus innovation. And so if we
Hmm.
take innovation and we apply it to being a problem solving or a cause driven, purposeful product, then I think the conversation changes. If we engineer our marketing and bringing products to market and our storytelling, and it's so omnipotent and so, you know, me too focused and versus, focusing on the importance of being creation versus the impact and the why it matters. I think that's oftentimes the danger, with marketing. And that's a little bit of my job is policing that and making sure that the benefits and the real need is not lost in the process.
Very cool. Very cool. So you were mentioning earlier that sometimes you have to deal with things that are like 10, 15 years out. I mean, can you describe some of those things that are sort of hitting the market today and when you first heard about them?
Yeah, it's funny because years ago, I remember sitting in on a corporate presentation at a major tech company, and they're no longer, but you might remember the Palm product. So 3Com
Oh yeah, I
was the
love
company.
those. I
Yeah,
had an original Palm Pilot. I had a Trio 650. I love those.
yeah, before BlackBerry, right? There was Palm, and
Yeah.
everyone liked BlackBerry. But I was sitting on a presentation of the company, and the founder and the co-founder and CEO, Dr. Bob Metcalf, who is the inventor of Ethernet, which we all use daily, right? But he was talking about this future without highways and roads, and everything he was describing was one part internet, one part the hyperloop, and one part the autonomous cars. And he had this vision. And I remember going back and listening to that and in my head because it was so pungent to me. But it was very much like a Ray Bradbury, type
Mm.
of, reading a book. And then over time, I remember, the internet, we went from networking boom to the internet boom. And I was in that. That was really when my career was taking off and the internet digital age was happening. And Al Gore created the internet. But you realize Al Gore didn't actually create it. He just explained it better than most people. And
Yep.
and then it just kept evolving. But autonomous cars, I think, are one that I was introduced to very early on. But the autonomous car that we know as consumers was actually an autonomous capability that was being used more in a commercial grade. So it was
Hmm.
something that was being used for on corporate campuses and not for public consumption. And my first witness of seeing that was probably 1995, which is well
Wow.
before Tesla came out to market, right? And so because I'm in the Silicon Valley and I'm amongst some of these great think tank groups that are, Institute of the Future, and then there's the SETI group, and there's just so many different interesting incubators. And then we have Solve for X, came a little later on. And I'm still amazed when I see an autonomous car. And I was in Palo Alto, California recently, and I was walking down University Avenue and near your old college, and all of a sudden I had to jump back because the autonomous car came flying by me and it didn't stop. And I
Oh my
clearly
God. No.
and I clearly had the right of way.
Oh jeez. Some programmer is going to be whipped for that. That's not
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. But
No,
all the
the
good.
same thing happened to me in Mountain View. I was sitting outside with a bunch of friends having a drink, and we look over, and there's a truck sitting there, and there's no driver, right at the stop sign, and then it goes through, and I'm like, "Whoa, what did we just see?" It was so bizarre to see something like that. I mean, obviously only in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, where else are you going to see something like that?
Yeah, you're not going to see that in Iowa, probably. But I think one of the things that's great about autonomous technology, and if you look at the supply chain and trucking and the things that got frozen, so to speak, or and were impacted during the pandemic, with autonomous trucking and freight type services, we can
Yep.
still deliver. We can still meet schedules. We can actually ensure that hospitals are getting their supplies, that communities are getting, the food and accessibility to different things. And so I think there are applications where autonomous makes total sense. I personally, a little bit of a control freak. I like my hands on the wheel, and I fly. I'm also a private pilot, so
Hmm.
I kind of an old school. I like piston engines, and I like being able to know that I have to tell the plane what to do. So, in terms of the electrification of transportation and been thinking greener and leaner, and as it relates to agriculture, as it relates to supply chain, and for us just to be more conscious as individual commuters or drivers, that excites me because I do think the next generation will probably benefit from that even more so than we have. And I think about how we go from the idea of electrification. Electric vehicles aren't new, but if you go back and look historically when they first were presented, we probably weren't really paying attention because it was too futuristic. And now it's conversational and topical, and people are adopting. And I go under this scenario of, do we adapt or do we adopt? And I think oftentimes I'm a late adopter. I wait for, when I had my Nokia phone that I didn't want to give up.
I had one too.
Nokia, didn't want to give up a Nokia phone because it was cute and red. And then eventually it's like, wow, okay, there's this thing called, BlackBerry, and that's kind of cool. And then eventually it was like, okay, I guess I'll sell out and get my iPhone, which I, really appreciate because in being in communications, I have some of the best content and digital things right in the palm of my hand. And when I first started out as a journalist, I was the first one in the newsroom with a computer.
Hmm.
Nobody else had one. It was
Wow.
like, let the new kid on the block have the computer. And now you go into a newsroom, well, they're going to be a lot smaller in general, but everything is digitized and everything is,
The newsroom is
connected.
all around us. The newsroom is wherever you happen to be, right? I mean, it's
Exactly.
almost it's atomic now. It's all little bits everywhere. But it's interesting what you should mention earlier about science fiction is because I think that's the best visions actually do come out of really good hard sci-fi. I find it's like that's one of the this is one shortcut to what's happening next. Just look at some really good hardcore sci-fi. They've figured it out, right? We just have to
Yeah.
how to see how we get to that vision. It's kind of like if you go back to Star Trek. It's like a lot of people were inspired to actually create was being presented in that program, right? It's like where did the StarTech phones come from? The flip phones. Flip phones probably came from that original vision, right? So that's where a lot of this stuff came from.
Yeah, when you think about it, space pioneering now versus where we started. So when I was a kid, I mean, we would talk about the missions and to the moon for months in advance before they even happened, and it was the countdown. Literally, everyone just got around the TV, and now it's like, oh wait a minute, someone just went into space today, and it seems almost commonplace that, not that I expect it, but it's become so advanced and so accessible, much more accessible. And these programs going from private to more public sector, I'm personally excited about. I would love to go to space. I don't need to go to Mars. I don't need to go to any other specific planet, but I would just like to have the personal experience as
Yeah.
a pilot to experience what does that feel like. And I think the imagery, I love watching the NASA updates every day. The imagery that we get from the satellites and from the various missions are just amazing to me. But what I think is even more important is what we can learn, not just necessarily the exploration, but groups like the Center for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI group. I think what they do is fascinating in terms of looking at how can we actually improve our agriculture, how can we actually include better improve our our carbon footprint, and things that they learn from gathering and collecting information from other planets and from even the ocean and other places on the earth that we haven't even used rightfully yet for improving how we live. And that's the same group that brought us that really funky looking crab a few years ago that we didn't know about. And they found, I think it was beetles living in bamboo someplace, and different things that we just don't even think about. And so I still think in the when you were the word, discovery, the discovery and the curiosity, um, I think we still have a lot of things to explore, and that's goes back to the mindset of a futurist and an idea shaper and maker, is that they're imagining that anything is possible. And I like to live in that scenario, and I think the world needs a nice dose of this right now, is that there's anything is possible. And so if we actually imagine the best case scenario, not the worst case scenario, technology can actually be used as a facilitator. In the wrong hands, it can actually be very destructive. And so I mentioned the number two pencil. Number two pencil is not a weapon. It's a really great tool. Now, I remember as a kid being told not to run with my pencil. So I know that it could be
Especially if it's sharp, right?
exactly.
But actually, it was interesting something that you touched on there. I really want to know, how did SETI find these things internally? I mean, aren't they looking outwards? Aren't they looking to the rest of the universe? How do they
Yeah,
find these?
I want to spend some time with him. In fact, I met the president recently and we had a really interesting chat. He 100+ distinguished scientists that are working steadfast on these different discoveries. And it's fascinating to me because they are looking not at the obvious, they're looking at the unobvious. And so they do a lot of research and explorations. They have, college organizations and research groups that work alongside with them. But what just it fascinated me in my conversation with him was how vast the group was. I didn't realize that they were so they had grown so much. I was thinking it was a couple of maybe a dozen scientists, and that it was
Mhm.
hundreds plus distinguished scientists. And I think that type of research is really important. Now, what comes out of any of that research could be the, thinking about the future and the innovations that you and I might adopt. And you mentioned the phone and the phone in space. Well, there could be some medical advancement that is created based on some research. There could be, lately I've been talking to a lot of, I'm going to call them food scientists, but
Mm.
people that are actually flipping the different food industries on its head. So animal food supply chain, and wanting it to be green and plant-based, and taking the animals out of the animal supply chain. Plant-based cheese. So you think about the Impossible Burger. I mean, that has been a huge phenomenon and a hit, but that started as an idea, which became like literally the impossible that became very possible. And so I think there's a lot of markets that are recalibrating themselves. The food industry, agriculture industry. I think advancements in healthcare and pharma. I recently worked with a doctor who is a full-time orthopedic surgeon, but I don't know how he managed to have the time plus 6 kids, but he also creates medical grade products on a
Whoa.
continuous basis. And he brought a low grade UV light product that helps you disinfect and sanitize and zap 99.9% of the ugly pathogens and bacteria and things that we've all been very conscious of the last couple of years. And to me, it was such a simple idea. I mean, he took what he was using as a doctor and then consumerized it so that people like you and I can simply download an app and use this device, swipe our computer, our restaurant table, or our airport tray, wherever we may be in the classroom, and made it accessible to people like us. And I think that's the beauty of the advancement in science and research is we need to support those types of research centers and groups. Yesterday, I spoke to a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo who is focused on ethics and technology. And I was just
Hmm.
intrigued by her knowledge and understanding of not just the user experience, engagement, and relationship that we have of products, but whether or not the product should do or perform what it's been intended to do. Again,
Hmm.
in the right hand, it could be a really powerful tool. In the wrong hand, it could actually be something that could change us socially, dynamically. You know, And so in a world of values driven equity and inclusion culture that we're now much more conscious of, and the Zoomers are going to force the boomers, millennials, the X's. Everyone forgets about the X's. The
I
X's,
know.
right?
I'm an
Like,
X, and it's like just whoop, just like
I
right over.
know, like what happened to us? So but that the cultural ecosystem, and I think the end user expectation. It's funny because on my podcast lately, I've kind of checked the boxes how many Gen X's and I've interviewed, and that was interesting. And they all talk about their Game Boys and and their in the video games and all those things. And then you get to the Zoomers, and the Zoomers are like they're actually doing really very carefully curated, thoughtful things. They
Hmm.
care about the earth. They care about social consciousness. They're very much like their grandparents, the boomers, and that are much more peace, love, and understanding. And I think that's really interesting, and will probably shape how we live and work in the future. They might not want Alexa in their living room. They might want to just say, you know what, I don't want to be digitally connected to the world. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Yeah, I had that same conversation with a Zoomer once because I have this thing about agency. It's like I wish that a lot of things that I had to do I didn't have to do anymore. That software could just take it off my back and just do it for me. And I was describing how wouldn't it be great if all the hundreds of little things that you have to do during the course of a day could just be taken care of by automation? Because a lot of times our systems around us know kind of what needs to be done. And she was saying, "Oh no, I don't want that. I want agency. I want to control all this stuff. I want to make sure that I'm doing this or I know what's happening." And I'm like, it was like a total generational gap there where I'm going, I don't want to. I want to do less, and she's saying I want to do more. And I thought that's such a flip.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've had a PR agency the last 20 years, and the progression of kind of work office styles. Uh, I'm the type of person that wants to be highly collaborative, engaging, and have meetings and conference rooms. I'm not, I don't feel highly collaborative, engaging if we're all wearing a different headset and we're on a dashboard and we're all having a virtual meeting, but we're sitting right next to each other. That just
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. And
That's
that
fun
kind of goes,
when everyone's at a laptop at your
and that kind of takes you into this vortex of kind of like that video augmented world, right? Is that you can tune out but be connected, and it's I'm very situationally aware of my surroundings, and that's just one of the skills that you learn even more when you're a pilot. And I take that same sensitivity and situational awareness and apply it into other things. And so I think when it comes to adopting technology, people should look for things that work for their lifestyle and not that something that a big brand or an individual imposed on them.
Mhm.
I know that if I were to give my daughter a really great earphone or earbud set, she would be enthusiastically happy. If I were to
Right.
give that same set to my son, he would probably regift it just because. And they're only 14 months apart. It's just
Yeah.
their acceptance and their adoption of things are very different.
Yeah.
She was the gamer.
Hmm.
She was the one that was disconnected. You know.
Wow.
I have another kind of a joke about that is uh, she's studying sociology and neuroscience together. She wants to be very aware of the impact of things and people and society. Just I think it was really an interesting approach. She wants to save the world.
Hmm.
My son, on the other hand, wants to save 30% on the next designer cell. But they're the same generation.
Interesting.
I think with that said, where I was going with that is it's not a one size fits all, technology world that we live in. And I rather like, on the weekends, disconnecting, unplugging, whatever you want to call it. Recalibrating is a word that I like. But I was just in Las Vegas for the CES 2022, and there were some amazing things that were on display, pheasant under glass, that won awards this year that I don't think the world really even saw because it was such a reduced, presence show. But I think things that are advancements that are happening in, personal health care and in pet care, mobility, things that, will not put us in the Wall-E-esque world that we might see in the movie Wall-E, but are actually things that will help with mobility and with health and longevity. And I think if we look at marketplaces, like the Impossible Burger, is that's the food category, but there's also hopefully some health and other components to, living a longer life that fits into that advancement of that technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, see, it's funny you should mention CES because it totally slipped my mind this year,
It
and I used to
happened.
follow it like crazy, and now it feels like what happened? And that's where you usually see most of the cool stuff. Did you see anything really weird or cool or cutting edge that you wanna talk about?
Yeah, I was with a electric, high performance electric motorcycle company I work with out of Canada called Damon Motors, an amazing company and team, but they're created basically the Ducati in the EV category. So a lot of enthusiasm, excitement about traditionalists wanting to convert, to electric. We also work with electric tractor companies, so we were there challenging, John Deere and,
Hmm.
and who is a very
Wow, that must have been
traditionalist.
interesting.
Yeah. But I also saw a lot of, in the personal health market and things that were for infant care, that were for no neurological advancements, but really meant for reducing PTSD and anxiety and things like that, which the world has gone through a lot. So things that were for, early primary care all the way to elder care.
Nice.
There was Yeah, and there wasn't a lot of booth activity, but there was definitely in their award-winning showcase area, products that were prime. One of the By being there, I was able to, see, there was still a pretty big European contingency. And one of the companies that I think to watch is based out of the Ukraine,
Hmm.
called Delfast. And they're formerly a courier company to deliver goods. And then they realized that by building the high performance bicycles that they needed to be effective couriers, the bike itself became their market. And
Wow,
so
very cool.
they're building between the United States and Ukraine. And fabulous story of just going from recalibrating, the need, um, and changing the supply chain. And so what I get most excited about with technology is, oh, the places we can go, or
Hmm.
or the things that we can do, right? And I just look at, advancements as we all, our phones and our keyboards have just become commonplace. But I remember working with the word processor, and I remember learning to type with the typewriter. I have a niece who actually is gone reverse engineering, and she has one of my old typewriters. And so
Wow.
she's writing her poetry using a typewriter because it's quite beautiful and elegant. And I thought, wow, I never thought that somebody would actually want to go back in time, because usually we're such in a hurry to go forward in time.
Yep. Well, have you seen those the Hemingway Free Write, which looks like a typewriter, but it's actually electronic?
Yeah.
And I have one of those to do my blog posts on, something like that, which the Alpha Neo Smart, which was like a huge thing in classrooms maybe about 10, 15 years ago. It was just a keyboard, and it has enough memory, and it has like a 4-line LCD screen. So
Yep.
it's a great distraction-free device, and it's about $50 on eBay. Free Write's about six, 700, $400. It seems like that we're getting this analog digital mishmash or mashup happening. So we're taking the best of the past and bringing it into the future, and I love seeing stuff like that happening because it's a great new direction.
Yeah. I want to tell you one thing you can't replicate though: the smell of ink.
True.
I used to say,
And the ink
I
on your fingers when your ribbon like
yeah,
all
you
starts
can't
twirling up.
replicate. I love that. Is one of my favorite smells to this day. Is like, well, I like lavender and I like cinnamon as well. but I love the smell of ink, from the ribbon
Mm-hmm.
cartridge. A little messy, but I also just remember memories of being with my father and his brothers and running the family printing and publishing business. And I would go through the printing arena, we call it, and I would just smell the ink. Now that's just a personal kind of fond memory. Most people today won't even know what that smell is,
Yeah,
and it might
exactly.
be, might be a little putrid to some, but
No, I love that too. It's interesting you should mention that because I mean I live in Silicon Valley too. I wasn't born here, but it's kind of like we can see sort of like the past, the present, and the future, and we've made personal decisions not to go too far forward. Like you were talking about, like for example, everybody I know does all of their shopping online. I still like doing a lot in person. There's like elements that we can see this, we can do it, but we actually step back and make the choice not to. Have you noticed that?
yes. In fact, during the pandemic, I had created my own little ecosystem. I decided that if I couldn't buy it at Ace Hardware, or if I couldn't buy it at my local little Zanato's Italian grocer market, which is a small gourmet market, which is probably about, I'd say maybe 10 blocks from me. If I couldn't get it from either one of those places, I didn't need it. And the supply chain was broken. I could go online in any app and try to get things delivered, but they had such a backlog, it might take 3 or 4 days, right? Amazon was always very agile and out and about. But I just kind of said, you know what? I'm not going to respond to this. I'm actually going to a backyard garden. And if I couldn't get it at the hardware store, at the local grocery store, I didn't need it. That lasted me about 4 months. I also
That's
didn't
good.
drive my I also didn't drive my car for 4 months, which literally I would have to go out and start my car and just warm it up and just make sure, there weren't, mice living in it or something. But I just felt that I was going to do the opposite, which my daughter was home from college and DoorDash was her best friend. And I'm just like, no, I'm
Right.
not going there. Not going there. I don't
Mm-hmm.
need the 31 flavored bubble tea drinks delivered to my home to make me feel good.
I still can't believe that people do DoorDash Baskin Robbins. I mean, how does that work?
Is that a thing? I mean, we could have
Yeah,
done that for this call. We could have just had a little ice cream chat.
we could have had. Yeah, it could have been an ice cream social kind of thing. We could have done that. Oh man. So in your profession, you've seen it. You've seen it. How long have you been doing this for now? You said 20 years or so.
I've had my PR agency, LMGPR, which means leadership, momentum, and growth, which is what I help
Mm-hmm.
companies do, is bring their great ideas to market. We had our 20-year anniversary in the pandemic, and nobody knew. So
Oh well,
I can actually,
congratulations.
so I can redo,
I'll
I
give
can
you.
do it again.
Could have a second one.
Yeah, I'll
So
celebrate in 2022.
So must it, looking back over the last 20 years, I mean, the industry must have changed a lot. Like can you tell me about like good and bad things that have happened to your industry?
Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest changes that's happened in technology is the convergence, right? And so when I
Mm-hmm.
first started my business, I had a lot of cybersecurity. There was a lot of all the mess that we creating this digital world that we're always on world needed some fixing. So that meant data center infrastructure, security, just a lot of forensics and analytical things needed to kind of tame the beast. That eventually moved into um, being able to have transparency and insight into other things, so augmented reality and like working with things like the Garmin GPS and things like that we just take for granted now that it's included in your car. We're kind of individual siloed type products. And then over time, I started seeing, a lot of this technology, both the artificial intelligence as well as the security, as well as like the augmented started going into transportation. So that ultimately meant, well, I actually have a vertical market that I can speak to where all this comes together. So one of my sweet spots ultimately became transportation and mobility. So anything with 2 wheels, 4 wheels, which is exciting because that's then eventually the autonomous and everything started coming with that. The biggest change that I've seen in terms of like communications aspect is that we are an always on culture and the speed in which we can deliver, content, right? And so the means also the other component is that the type. So you mentioned you have a blog and we both have a podcast. So the tools that we use to communicate, I think, have gotten much richer and more dynamic. And the knowledge, I think people are thirsty for knowledge and they want to gain, insight and content. So I think, blogs and podcasts and creating your own original content, and whether you're an individual, business like myself, or you're a Fortune 500 company, having control over your IP and your content has become really important. And I think the other component I'm seeing now more is the creators market. So in different industries, whether it's music or it's digital assets, so thinking things like Getty Images, for example, National Geographic content, all this content that's been around and archived and stored in the cloud in different places are now being put into NFTs and being used as a creative opportunity to control that content and managing the the integrity of that content into these things we now call blockchains. I think it's fascinating. And I was trying to think, what futuristic book did I read or was out there that kind of visualized that component? And I can't think of one, to be honest. I was
No, me
trying to
neither.
think with, yeah, where did that evolve from? uh, but I think that's one of the cool components is now you can actually go by, and Elon Musk has talked about this himself. With cryptocurrency, you can actually go buy an autonomous electric car.
hmm
That's just almost sounds like a strange statement.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I don't think I would have even had a conversation with anyone and said, oh, with my cryptocurrency, with my Ethereum, I actually went and bought myself $100,000 car. It's so cool. And people are like, what is, and I still think there's a lot of what's next.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about, so what's next. So I think the markets that will keep advancing are mobility, transportation, agricultural, healthcare. Those are the markets that I'm seeing a lot of excitement.
So the other thing that's happened, sort of like the way for startups to get noticed in the world has really changed. I mean, have you seen like what's the most effective tactic nowadays? Because there's just so much noise out there. How do you get heard above the noise?
You know what? Believe it or not, there's some real old-fashioned techniques that is tried and true that don't go away. So the first one, the one I think is most important, and it's been the hardest to do the last couple of years, is literally the tangible, pop-up or meet and greet, taking the product on a roadshow or bringing it. In the case of one of my clients, which is a crime-fighting robot, we actually have a pod that travels around the U.S. and goes on tour, continuously on tour. And so
Nice.
you're literally taking the rock star robots on tour, but being able to have a high performance motorcycle needs to have a crowd, right?
hmm
And certain products like the seeing is believing really matters. I think the other is knowledge, and not just we live in a world of in marketing where we constantly want to just show all the things that it does, and it's like, well, that's great, but show me the why. I was really disappointed to find out the beta stores, I don't know if all of them are gone or just the one within my area,
Yeah, the
but I
Santana
love,
Row one is closed up. I know. I'm like,
but I
what
love going
happened?
there, looking at this products and going, wow, this is really cool, because I didn't know this was out so early, previews of products. But I think the other component, that is conversations like this. We are going back to conferences. People
Yep.
are thirsty for information. So, there are, I think I'm signed up for 5 conferences this next year to either attend or speak. So the in-person engagement is happening again, which is great. But I think companies, when it comes to, you know, I always got the lemonade stand. You go to your website, and that's one component of your lemonade stand. Testimonials from people, personas that are in YouTube, that are in podcast. Um, it's a busy, noisy world to get, your brand and your product elevated. But I think it's really, it comes around being authoritative and being an
Hmm.
expert. So if any company that I work with, I like to not just necessarily the founders, but are there other authorities within the company. So Monarch Tractor, as an example, is an amazing company. One of the founders came, from Tesla and created the Gigafactory. One of the other founder of the company, he has been in the automotive industry space for several decades. The third one is a fifth generation winemaker, legacy Mondavi family,
Wow.
winemaker turned chief. Love this title, chief farming officer. The CFO is no longer the
A new
CFO.
kind of CFO. I love it.
Yeah, and so to me, it's interesting because you've been in the industry, so you know that Silicon Valley is a land of opportunity. People
Hmm.
came here for agriculture and for promise and opportunity. One of the best kept Silicon Valley stories I just love is the James Lick story, the Lick Observatory in the top of San Jose and Mount Hamilton Road. And any of the audience can go look this up, but I just love the passion of wanting to have a vista and be able to gaze and look at the stars when there was no city lights and it was agriculture and farming, and do all this lens from France all the way across the ocean up a very steep hill, only to put it in a place and find out it's cracked
Oh no, I know.
and to start again. And I'm going, that's the perseverance. That is the epitome and the passion that we know from tech innovators and entrepreneurs. It was no different now than it was back when James Lick said, "Hey, I got a few dollars in my pocket. I'm actually going to be super eccentric, and I'm going to put a massive telescope on top of this mountain." I mean, people
Which
have
is
thought he was.
amazing. Everyone whoever comes here has to visit it because it is the most amazing site. I mean, it's over 100 years old. It's 100 something years old, and it's just phenomenal.
Well, and a couple of years ago, it was at a ring of fire around it, right?
Hmm.
And I had a friend from college who was posting pictures. He was on a mission to data collect and archive as much as they could because there's so much history that is preserved up there, but it's not. It was in paper form,
Yep.
you know, with scientists and dignitaries from around the world have visited, and all this content was in there. Yeah, and to me, that's just kind of a magical component. Is I always tell people that we're so focused on looking at our phone, and we're so focused of looking down. If you just look up every once in a while, you're going to see something different. We have the opportunity as individuals to see the world with a different lens. Look at things different. Look like a photographer. Look in, for morning light, look for afternoon, look for evening light. And I think that's one of the things about technology is when I adopt something, I have to look at it a few times. I have to look at it as a different lens. I personally, I don't need a Roomba. I
Yeah. Me
don't,
neither.
and I don't really want Alexa in my living room. And
Listening in on us.
right. And so, but I really do like some of the advancements they made in appliances
Hmm.
and doing smart, low energy efficient appliances, solar, appliances.
Yep.
Um, the millennials and Zoomers, they don't really, cook because they have this, Lux supply chain that
Yeah.
they've created, but that's going to change. And I think that the kitchen, I mean, my grandmother, my goodness, would never think that people would gather in the kitchen and eat in the kitchen. Like, what is this open concept about? Why would you do that? Everything was
Exactly.
compartmentalized, right? But you think
Hmm.
about that was one of the things that CES was great, was the appliance section, is seeing, what was coming into the house of the future. And so the house of the future, and we know this for a while, it's an IoT smart house.
Hmm.
And the Internet of Things was also an acronym that nobody understood. I remember 20 years ago having an Internet Things um, discussion, and someone described to me Nest, and I thought, well, that's the goofiest thing. Like, why would I? What do we need this, right?
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
all saw what happened there. So I missed that one, but but I think that's one of the opportunities that we have as individuals. We can also influence. We can say no. You know, we can say no. I don't want this type of. This is invasive, or this isn't. Violates my personal values, or in when it comes to ethics and technology. But I like to think that the younger generation, those kids that actually have grown up even in the pandemic, being in the Zoom world and going to class or Zoom school, that they're going to look back at the their childhood and the advancements that they will that they experience that allowed them to continue to learn and hopefully thrive. And that's going to be the generation that's going to do what the gamer and develop gamer and then eventually game developer community did. Hopefully those kids are going to be the ones that are to say, oh, well, we can use our knowledge and our understanding of being you know disconnected is and connected at the same time. It will be interesting to see what that generation does, because I think the
Yeah.
STEM and you mentioned it briefly, but STEM education is just something I'm just so when I was growing up, we had a STEM education. We just didn't call it STEM education. It was
Yep.
just given. Then we started defragging and taking things out of the curriculum, including music, right? It was like everything was optional. And unless you went to a private school or for a very well-funded school, not all kids had the same access. And so I think what's one of the things that is happened and where the digital classroom has become important is the accessibilities. I mean, teachers I mean have a really tough job, but I'm excited when I see kids and take on challenges, and they're doing like basic things like block coding when they're like 5 years old.
Hmm.
And you have kids that have different learning abilities. You have autistic kids working with kids who don't are mainstream, and you put them together and they can do some amazing things. And I've gone through robotics boot camps and workshops and seen, the kids. There's no gender-based science or math, which is exciting, because when I was a kid, I was told that I went to the boys' math. I didn't know if there was a gender, but I took the
Well,
harder
I,
math
I I was in
classes.
shop, and my girlfriend was in home ec, right? Those are
Yeah.
the differentiators.
Yeah, and so I took the boys' math apparently because I liked math and sciences, and so I took the hard stuff, and I wasn't supposed to want to take the hard stuff. And I think that gap is closing. 28% of women in STEM related jobs. I I don't have a STEM related degree. I have a journalism, in economics degree. I had to do some form of math and science, but I work with some with amazing people who are really schooled and educated, and it's always exciting for me the things that I learn, from their DNA. But I think we really need to, look to the future and support any, public schools, private, nonprofit, wherever we can, and ensure that continuous cycle of innovation and nurturing is happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm thinking. I'm sorry, Emma. If we're running out of time. We don't have time to do Think Like a Futurist, so we're gonna have
Ice cream melted.
we're gonna have to have another show. This has been fascinating. I love talking to you. We should definitely do this again. We'll have another episode.
Yeah,
But
and we're neighbors.
yes, exactly. Maybe we'll do it in person. Who knows? It's
That could be
entirely possible.
fabulous. I'll bring my Berkeley pendant.
I love it. So, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
A couple of ways. Donna Loughlin, and that's Loughlin on LinkedIn, one of my favorite places to camp out. Before It Happened is my podcast. So it's Before It Happened show on Instagram and all the major platforms. And you can also just go to lmgpr.com for the tech agency.
I love it. Well, I'm gonna subscribe right now as soon as we get off the phone. Thank you so much. It was great
Wonderful.
talking with you.
Okay, thank you so
Talk to you
much.
later. Bye bye.